And welcome to the grand finale of the Summer of Love. As the summer fades away, we are here for our last sparkling day of talking about digital romance, love and media, love and technology. And today's session is a great way, I believe, to kind of wrap up and think through the different themes that we have explored throughout these sessions um, by means of this idea of posthuman eros, whatever it means. And we will have a bit more of an insight of what it actually may mean. Thanks to Dominic Pettman. Dominic, thank you for joining us today. I was very happy when you said yes to my invitation. There's an article that Dominic published quite a few years ago for Theory, Culture and Society. If I remember well, it's called Love Tamagotchi. And then when I read that article, I read it like 3-4 years ago, and I was just at the beginning of my exploration of love and digital technology. And it was a massive source of inspiration. And then I got all Dominic's books. So I'm a bit of a fan, I'm a bit of an academic fan of your work. And Dominic just published his last book, whose title is Peak Libido. And this is somewhere here, perhaps I can show it. Or I should have prepared this before.
Thanks,
Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. And this is part of a unofficial trilogy that involves also creaturely love, that I have it in my bedside table. And then what was the name of the other book?
Sonic Intimacy.
Sonic Intimacy, exactly. Yeah. And in a sense, they all also trace back to love and other technologies. That is a book you published a bit before, and it's there. So today is a great way for us and for me to hear more from Dominic. Dominic, in case you don't know him, but I guess you are one of these famous intellectuals. So Dominic is a professor at the New School. And so yes, it would be a great way for us to kind of follow your talks and your thinking around these topics. And who better than you to actually reflect and make a point about the connection between love and media, love and technology. And then we have the glorious Sarah Cefai. Sarah Cefai is a lecturer at Goldsmiths, and I was very happy to have a reason to connect to her, inviting her to this series of seminar, and then to respond to Dominic, because she's working on topics such as intimacy, intimacy and technology, social media, affects, and she writes gorgeous stuff in a very, I think, in a very innovative way to some extent. She's someone that likes to experiment with creative ways of writing. That's something, a piece on Tinder, it's really suggested reading. So yes, thank you, Sarah, for being here today. And I think I've presented you in a bit of an informal way, but this is our style and we like it. And I don't have a card with a perfect bio, but please feel free to tell everything about yourself that I haven't already said. Right, so the format of today is the same, but in case you are new to this series, and we will have our guests talk about their ideas. We'll start with Dominic, and then Sarah will follow, and then we'll open up the floor for debate. Is there something else that I should say? I should thank Nate. The director of the Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick, that at some point got in touch with me, inviting me to join the center and asking if I wanted to do something. And then I said, yes, I want to do something. So Nate is our deus ex machina, in the back, but actually always present. Okay, good. I think I've spoken enough. And Dominic, the floor is yours. And please do feel free to complete my, what can I say, creative biography of you.
Absolutely. Well, just thanks so much for the invitation. It's really great to be part of this series, which I've been really enjoying. So thank you for putting it together. Such great people. There's still one or two left I'm saving to see, but they've been extremely interesting. And I like this kind of informal, actually salon kind of way of doing things. It's really great. And thanks to Sarah for agreeing to be part of today. I'm also a fan of her writing. I've come to realize, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And thanks to everyone here who's taking time out to have their lunch or dinner or whatever the time is where you are. I should begin with a little apology to those who are familiar with my work, because it's going to be just a kind of top bullet point greatest hits, I guess, or at least the sort of sketch of the trajectory. So because I did just teach a course called Posthuman Eros actually last semester, and one of the great things about such open terminology is that obviously the last thing we want to do is affix a definition, and it's so it's just a good space to sort of test our thinking against or with. But as Carolina suggested, I've been rethinking the relationship between desire and technology for longer than I care to think about. I guess it really is almost coming up to 30 years now. And way back, I was just talking to Nate, actually, who's also from Melbourne. My PhD thesis in the mid-90s was, well, it kind of argued that pre-millennial tension, which was a big thing at the time, is in essence libidinal, suspended between anticipation and exhaustion. I was taking my cues a lot from Baudrillard. So living after the orgy, but before the test results was the way I kind of put it at the time. After the millennium came along, I then had this, epiphany that I've been trying to unpack ever since, that eros and techne are not separate terms that influence or impact each other, even symbiotically, but they're two sides of the same coin. In short, as my book suggests, love is a technology. And so one of the primal scenes for this claim is Plato's famous Symposium, maybe the first place in the West, so-called West, where we try to think through love philosophically. There's the famous tale of the androgynous creatures who get separated and then crave their other half, literally, which is obviously a metaphor we still use. And one thing people tend to forget is that when they are lucky enough to re-find their other half, how do they get back together? And it's Hephaestus. I think he's also known as Vulcan. That's the same figure, right? Depending if you're Roman or Greek, but the blacksmith had to fuse them together with his instruments. So even then, in this allegorical, distant, foggy past, we're using technology in intimate, erotic ways. So even the primal scene speaks about this is an intervention, materiality and mediation. So people that were influencing me at the time were well-known thinkers, and I'm afraid they were mostly dudes back then, for sure. Foucault, of course, how desire is elicited and encouraged and inflected, measured, deployed, etc. Technologies of the self. But I was also taken with his quip that the soul is the prison of the body. Luhmann, who Niklas Luhmann, German systems theorist, not the most sexy guy to read, but very provocative, suggestive ideas. And he does actually make quite an elegant little definition of the kind of love I'm thinking of, which is the codification of intimacy. So that intimacy always must be coded in some way, or it would not be read as such. It has to be legible as intimate, at least for humans. And then that gets all complicated too when we start to think about the animal world. Another kind of orientation point was René Girard and his famous claim that desire is always already mediated and even mimetic. It doesn't belong to you. Your desire doesn't come organically, authentically from you, but you kind of learn what to desire from others, and then you imitate that. And yes, well, of course, you know, it's hard to avoid Lacan, and you know, his nutshell idea that there's no sexual relationship. That's an intriguing thing to think through, especially if you're talking about mediation and communication, miscommunication as communication. And Baudrillard actually does put a kind of positive spin on this elliptical asymptotic idea about sex that his book Seduction, which I think is one of his best, it's quite short, but he makes a distinction between seduction and love, and obviously favors the former. Not the kind we tend to think of today, which is cynical. He calls that siegecraft, just being a player, not very interesting to him, but a more ceremonial kind of, I think of it as a game of capture the flag almost, the way he thinks of seduction, which is a real kind of recognition of the difference of the other, and not, as he thinks of love, as much about emotional blackmail, trying to absorb the other, this kind of grasping white knuckle way of thinking about desire. And you know, we have the usual suspects. So Deleuze and Guattari, and the idea of desiring machines is not necessarily being metal things that with lights and switches that go beep, but kind of organic arrangements even. Anything that works in a kind of machinic way. And Bernard Stiegler and his idea of originary technicity, that however far back you go, there's techne, but also his idea of the pharmacon, that technology, it's sort of beside the point to demonize it or celebrate it. It's either, depending on the context, quantity, etc., it's either a poison or a cure. So that was my, I guess that's my wheelhouse. That's my Greek chorus, as it were, who would always sing in my ear as I was trying to write in those earlier days. So what I hope is coming across already is that I don't try to claim that love is a technology in a reductionist way, as it may sound at the beginning, that, you know, it's like a tool, it's something instrumental or utilitarian. It's to bring up the Bavarian in the room. Heidegger did influence me, his piece on especially on technology, that it's not, but it's also an art. It's a way of bringing forth or making things. So his big distinction isn't between organic and inorganic, but between a kind of just technology proper and a modern technology that demands too much. So what his protest against modern technology is that he says it's an unreasonable demand of nature, which I think is also a nice definition of love in some ways. So I am torn between, or I toggle between, the idea of Eros as being this eternal thing that we can trace back almost in an unbroken line to Plato and to Sappho, and even before that in different traditions. But at the same time, it's always reinvented. There's always a torsion or a twist through different technological paradigms or epochs. So it can be useful, at least for me, to think, use this terrible Silicon Valley terminology of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And so if love 1.0 is kind of classical symposium type, love 2.0 might be chivalry, courtly love, 12th century Provence. Love 3.0 would be romantic, Goethe, Byron. Love 4.0 is where things get really interesting, with modern love. Think of the Bloomsbury set, all of that. And then we can discuss maybe if we're still in love 5.0, which would be the postmodern kind, post-Second World War with cybernetics and everything else, or if we're even into a 6.0, 7.0 by now, just for the sake of argument. So given that the medium is the message, the vectors through which desire circulates and expresses itself to reshape and retrofit eros. So it's not that you have this just thing called love and then you try and express it through specific media, but the medium that you are using will have a pretty strong influence over not just the way it's expressed, but even something substantial about it. So I'm not good at commitment in terms of intellectually, so I emphasize both the continuity and the novelty. So one of my little statements is also that, especially from, say, the Niklas Luhmann point of view, all sex is cyber sex, and maybe always has been. From this understanding, this expanded idea where it's about feedback loops, communication, and sort of cycles. But it's also true that cyber sex as a new practice, what we used to call that in the 90s, or concept, creates new possibilities, relationships, tones, affordances, blind spots, etc., as every technological development does. And just as we don't really live in virtual reality, I mean, it's surprising how little has changed actually since the 90s in some ways. I mean, we wouldn't be having this international meeting by Zoom, but we would have thought we'd be in some glittering Tron-like kind of place. And same with cyber sex, you'd think we'd be having, as some of your previous salons talked about, why aren't we having wonderful sex with exotic robots by now? Okay, so the pushback around this idea, it tends to emphasize the human. People do resist some of these claims I make. And so I decided then that it might be helpful to add my voice to the chorus, complicating and even in some ways banishing this category. So, just for the sake of provocation, I have a book that argues that human error, the great human error is to think that there's a thing called a human. It's a category mistake, an ongoing case of mistaken identity. And I carried over this kind of anti-humanist spirit to my unofficial trilogy, the one Carolina kindly mentioned on Eros and ecology. And so sonic intimacy looks at the voice, which we tend to think of as human. Animals can make sounds, but they don't have speech. It's the traditional philosophical distinction, which I wanted to complicate. So I looked closer at 4 different types of voice: the cybernetic voice, or the technological voice, which you're listening to right now. The gendered voice, which is historically problematic for the culture, as Kaja Silverman and others have shown. And then the creaturely voice, so what are animals trying to tell us or hide from us? And even more so, the ecological voice. So that's my most new age book, I think, where I get to even speculate on the idea of the vox mundi, the voice of the world, listening listening to the environment, as scientists try to do. Yes, it's a metaphor in some ways, but there's also something literal about listening to, say, glaciers melting. A lot of artists are doing fascinating things in this territory as well. Another case of where art and science maybe are starting to rekindle a romance that was, forbidden for a while. So yeah, I then, by the time Creaturely Love book came along, I was trying to test myself, and my instincts at this point were to always go, oh, whatever you think is human or organic, it's actually technological. Aren't I smart? And so I started to sort of try to work against these default modes of my own thinking by bracketing off the question of technology altogether just for that project. And it was to ask, how desire makes us more and less than human. And so I tried to explore ways in which other forms of animality, again, elicit or encourage, navigate, embody a kind of global libido. So it was trying to be a reminder that no matter how much we talk about cyborgs or how long we spend online, we're still essentially mammals. And we crave the touch of similarly warm-blooded creatures. So even if the technology is super advanced, it's trying to simulate creaturely contact. So yeah, just as one example, our childhood pets are an initiation into creaturely intimacy. In some ways, it's just as important as Freud's Oedipal protagonists. They're part of the family, as we know, so they come with their own baggage. So love is like that Voight-Kampff test in Blade Runner, where they tried to see if you're a replicant or a human, or a reverse Turing test. This was my argument, to make the beloved admit under passionate interrogation that they're not human, never were human, and were only trying to fool us with their sophisticated ways. And yeah, so the third book came out last year, Peak Libido, Sex Psychology and the Collapse of Desire. So that begins with this question, what is the carbon footprint of your desire? Which is a conceit to think about how entangled and connected something seemingly lonely and isolating like libido can often be. You can feel very alone with it, and has these sort of environmental impacts or effects or resonances, repercussions. The example that made me really think I had to write this book was the news reports about 50 Shades of Grey being so, once the popularity waned, what do you do with all these books? It sold so many copies of the actual books and filling up charity shops and what have you. And it turns out they couldn't be recycled because they used the wrong glue. The publishers used the wrong type of glue. So, you could almost measure this this ecological catastrophe connected to, again, a kind of global libido. Other examples were Pornhub had a campaign where they would plant trees. If you watched a certain amount of videos, they called it the Wood for Wood campaign, which is clever, but I don't know how effective it was. Condom companies putting endangered species on their packets to show that if you don't have kids, then you'll probably save this panther. And biodegradable sex toys are an interesting case as well. But we all know the news stories. There's the stories from Japan of people unable to leave their room, young people who should be dating and having fun, plummeting birth rates in the overdeveloped world, younger generations hooking up more and yet reporting having less sex than generations before them, etc. Something's going on, in terms of, there's a disturbance in the force if the force is libidinal. And what does that mean? How is that connected to other anxieties, other symptoms of contemporary life. Yeah, so one example is, oh yeah, it's a nice example just showed up in the chat of wildfires as a result of a gender reveal party. Yes, that would have been perfect for the book. Thanks for that one. So yeah, I try to look at some positive versions of this, symptoms of this, like or potentially positive. Eco-sexuality, Annie Sprinkle's project, which usually just raises a smile at this point, but has a kind of serious undertone, I think. She talks about, what would it mean to make love with Mother Earth? There's a manifesto, taking tree hugging to X-rated limits. And I love this term of it, pollinamorous, being pollinamorous. Hopefully you're not allergic. So yeah, I took a lot of this from Stiegler again, who did argue that our libido is being fracked basically. So the question of sustainability of desire is a really important one. We're alienated from our bodies, ourselves, our mediascape, each other. So he makes this kind of interesting distinction between drive. Obviously, we still want things. Capitalism is not about to collapse for want of wanting. But he calls that just sheer drive, almost. It's sort of automatic, almost instinctual at this point because of how good capitalism is conditioning us like Pavlov's dogs. This is in contrast to a kind of libidinal desire, which for him is about taking care. It's about an investment in the future. It's about taking time. So yeah, that's a pretty brilliant diagnosis, I thought, when I heard it. Was like, this makes sense. I mean, our libidos have been fracked to death almost, but we still are in this sort of compulsive mode of wanting. So what's the answer? That's harder to pin down. How to make kind of sex sustainable, ecologically sound, how to give it temporal integrity. We might offer something like a slow love program, akin to the slow food program. I'm trying to think what the equivalent of that started in Italy, of course, when McDonald's showed up. They were bulldozing the first McDonald's. Interesting to think about analogs in the love world, like Tinder, some kind of slow love response to Tinder, for instance. And I'm kind of to the point today where I'm thinking more about attention, because I think attention is almost another word for Eros, or at least you can't have one without the other. And so I'm trying to pay more attention to this question of attention and its ecological register, which Yves Sitton has written a very interesting book about. And maybe that's kind of enough to sketch is that about the right amount of time? Yes, okay. Yeah, so I at the end of Peak Libido, I just sort of ask if we might reinvent the idea of carnal knowledge as a positive thing, as a generative, desirable notion, to think through the wisdom of the body. But obviously, I don't pretend to have, all the answers from this diagnosis, and I look forward to hearing if others think I've got it completely wrong. And actually, I mean, part of critical thinking can be too negative. You wearing your Adorno hat a lot of the time. When I talk to my students, I'm also very mindful of all the exciting things that are happening right now around just a reconfiguration of the social contract with oneself and then with others, and obviously this is moving very quickly in a really interesting way. So it's never easy, it's never clear, but that's why we enjoy talking about it. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to say.
Exactly. We are totally against clarity.
Yes, well, I'm your person.
Like clarity, efficiency, transparency. We leave these to to other people. We swim into opacity, enigma, mystery, and that comes also as a handy justification of oneself and one thoughts. And yes, Nate, that's the paradox, the clarity of being against clarity. And here we go back to the liar paradoxes, and so back to our friends, the Greeks. Okay, for a better response to Dominic's talk, I shall hand over to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. And again, if you want to say something about yourself and what you're doing now that I haven't done in my unclear introduction, do feel free to say what you want. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and thank you, Dominic, as well. So I'm really grateful for this invitation because of the spirit and energy that Carolina's been bringing to the seminar series, which actually feels like a research series. So you've been really great at making us feel like participants in a process rather than an audience, which I think none of us want to be ever again post-Zoom. So this afternoon, yes, I've put myself forward for the somewhat daunting task of honouring some of the work of Dominic Pettman, and I have chosen to focus on his book that he published with Polity this year, called Peak Libido, Sex Ecology and the Collapse of Desire. And rather than talk about the central argument, which is that libido is at its peak, which means at the moment where it's about to fold over and collapse, I'm kind of interested in some of the ontological and epistemological shifts that are going on in the text, and especially the way that they are drawing on and developing the concept of ecology. And I really like this idea of kind of nature becoming a key protagonist in our specifically post-human story, and even the idea of kind of ecology becoming a protagonist. I was thinking about the idea, for example, from Ursula Le Guin of the carrier bag theory of fiction, where in fact the protagonist, the environment somehow like coalesces things and becomes a protagonist itself. So I quite like this idea of the ecology of a protagonist. So of course, the more you engage with ideas, the more they become part of the process of your own work. So there is quite a bit of me thinking through some ideas in what I'm going to say. So of course, the concept of the Anthropocene has already attracted a significant audience in academia and beyond, and we certainly can do a lot of work under this sign of the Anthropocene, which seeks to designate the impact of human history on the planet, while at the same time stressing the urgency with which we have to critique the kind of anthropomorphism of that and bring in feminist, decolonial, post-humanist and so on critiques and perspectives. But one of the things I really liked about the book is the way that Dominic has gone for these kind of very holistic concepts. So like libido is in a way like a very holistic way of thinking through eros, love, a whole range of other terms. And equally, I think that ecology is kind of the most holistic term we can use at this moment to talk about everything from like environmental catastrophe to interspecies relationality and so on. And I think there's something really interesting here going on in terms of other theoretical discourses that we're familiar with around, for example, materiality, affect, and so on. And so we can think about concepts like assemblage and the network and the kind of abstractions in a way that I think ecological modes of thinking are trying to displace. Or at least like form an entanglement with. So I've been really attracted to this idea of ecology, both in teaching and research. So I convene a third year MA option module for media communications and cultural studies. I will just plug the department here while the college is potentially under attack. So we teach a module, and we have a class where we teach ecofeminism together with decolonial feminism in the context of media cultures, and students are very responsive to this material. I think it's really exciting, and it's something that we might not have seen in a kind of feminist module 10 or 15 years ago. And in my own work, I'm really interested in how a concern with ecology transforms the way that we think about structures of feeling, which I think is another way that we could approach reading this particular book. So one of my many unanswered questions at the moment is what humiliation, which I'm interested in as a structure of feeling, looks like from the perspective of ecology. So how would the claim that we routinely humiliate our own environment transform our understanding of ecological belonging? What difference would it make, for example, to think about fracking or extraction as a humiliation? And I was reflecting that I think we do have already a kind of cultural and critical vernacular for this. We can just think back to something like Tracy Chapman's lyrics for the song The Rape of the World from the 1990s. So I think there might be a little bit of there's definitely there's a big interest in Indigenous studies and Indigenous politics and Indigenous knowledges and so on. But I think we have to be also careful about, potential appropriations and that there is. But one of the questions there is though, because of the nation. Sorry, I don't want to digress, but it's the question about secularity. So one of my questions is how secular is peak libido, especially because a lot of the cultural phenomena we're witnessing online is conjoins a search for a new ecological experience with some kind of spirituality. So I think there's a kind of a bundle of questions there as well. And that we also have many media archives that we can look at to kind of explore that. And I'll show some images towards the end. So yes, how much are you loving the sunshine? So my blind is actually broken. I finally have an office, yay! And the blind doesn't work. And I did climb up on the thing to get it halfway down. Obviously I should have brought it all the way down. But I'm not.
That's great, it looks prismatic.
I'm gonna try and fix it. It's just
you look super spiritual.
Yeah. Just as you said, secularism, the halo thing.
Secularism, exactly. The timing was perfect.
Okay, so in peak libido, Pettman makes at least two major moves. I hope I get it right. So firstly, he distinguishes between the economy of a libido and also the libido's ecology. And then secondly, he makes a distinction between a humanist and post-humanist ecology. So, of course, the shift from economy to ecology and from a humanist to a post-humanist ecology they're intertwined and they're parallel. So in a way, there's no point in trying to have an ecological perspective on libido if it's not also post-humanist, because if it's a humanist ecology, we just end up back in an economic rationality. So I really like the entanglement of these terms. I think it's right. And I really like the way that an emphasis on the notion of an economic libidinal economy, or thinking about the economic, kind of displaces neoliberalism a little bit as the object that we're also fixated on. So I kind of like the idea of extracting the logic of having an older origin, and also has origins in, of course, the family and capitalist modes of exchange. So Pettman understandably invokes Freud and Marx when he's kind of explaining this concept of the libidinal economy, and importantly, he does say that when he's reading, and I guess it's Fourier, but when he's reading him, he says, we need new economic relationships, so we're not just jettisoning. Of course, I didn't write quotation marks in my notes, so that might also be me, but maybe it's you. So we're not jettisoning the economic for the ecological. So he says that we should banish profit and admit our own natural impulses, and to cultivate a sustainable libidinal ecology. So when he goes back to reading Fourier, he talks about the origins of the economic in the household. And so I'm quoting Dominic here: the spontaneous signs of organizing the household, i.e. in both bedroom and kitchen, economy is inherently libidable. It is fundamentally a matter of gender sex desire, as well as the kinds of contracts and obligations these in turn engender. Freud understood the inescapably transactional nature of erotic experience. So what I'd like to, one idea I'd like to pull out and hopefully work on a bit more is actually this notion of exchange. And I'm really interested in what happens to the exchange, which is central to all those feminist, Marxist and anthropological critiques of heteropatriarchy as the establishing of relations between men through the exchange of women. What happens to those critiques when we move from the economic to the ecological? How does the transactional nature of erotic experience transform? And of course, that invites us to reflect on the specificity of what's exchanged in the erotic context, or in a libidinal context. So yeah, I really think this idea of exchange in relation to these different terms for the libido and different approaches to libidinal experience is interesting. Okay. I'll just move on to 11 minutes. Okay, so I'll read. So when he's talking about Freud, Dominic says that early Freud's definition of libido is something allied to or one aspect of eros, the self-preserving power of life which seeks to build alliances with others. And Pettman then goes on, it is the part of the self that seeks cathexis, to see oneself in and with the other as the most profound route to self-realization. For while we humans are intrinsically narcissistic, we are rarely completely solipsistic, which means we also require recognition from outside our own psychic apparatus. The libido is thus a kind of hunger, a go beyond the ego and reinforce the ego at the same time. So again, here I'm really interested in the notion of exchange, and like, to what extent should we be understanding that the role of regard and being seen by another as an exchange? And so while Pettman moves from economy to ecology, largely through this concept of sustainability, yeah, I'm wondering the importance of this concept of exchange in that move. One of the ways that Pettman moves from the humanist to the post-humanist ecology is through the shift from a humanist to a post-humanist sexuality. And here Pettman invokes a cultural anthropologist, Alfonso Lingus. And so Pettman says that Lingus's theory of sexuality as emerging from and responding to a vast and sweeping matrix of erotic pulsions and tumults. Pettman goes on, Lingus refuses to identify this quality as something belonging exclusively to us. Rather, it is a property or trait of life itself. So to say, the craving and longing in Eros are not really cravings of the I, longings for the I. They merely appear so thanks to our deeply ingrained cultural habits. In reality, according to Lingus, the longings of Eros are occasions of energetic excitation, vectors that use our sentient bodies as nodes of switching stations for their restless, continuous journey. So essentially, Pettman's saying, yes, Freud sets this up well in terms of biology, the environment, but then he goes on to misidentify the protagonists, the ego, the family, the phallus, neurosis, and so on, which of course is really wonderful news to my ears. So the reason that we're moving into a kind of post-humanist view of the libido is because we want to see libidinal life from its point of view. There are some other questions which around exchange in nature, but I'm concerned that in some way Pettman's already answered them in his book and I haven't quite grasped it, but I am kind of interested in whether nature exchanges with itself. So critical theorists often talk about mimesis and camouflage and, the way that there's a concept of the image and excess and so on in the natural world. So at what point do those kind of exchanges become transactional? And it's also, I was also thinking it's interesting that at some point you speak about the importance of barter and exchange in libidinal relationships within an economic framework. But then I was thinking about the way that people more recently are writing about the importance of debt and debt relations as those that underpin economic transactions or economic life or social life, as insofar as it's organized by economic life. So in some ways also I wonder to what extent the question about our indebtedness to our environment is also partly something that's driving the sort of ecological turn or interest in ecology, and then again like how we should be transforming or developing our concepts of exchange in relation to living in relations of debt, or our social relations being organized by relations of debt. I'm sorry, I'm slightly distracted because I didn't say something at the beginning. And so I just want to say that about the thing about humiliation and ecology, is that I think that's kind of, what's interesting is how an existing theory or politics of a structure of affect is transformed by an ecological approach. So, but that doesn't mean kind of looking to nature as such, because we can really look to urban environments. So for example, if you look at London's skyline, you see a systemic degrading of life. So you see the degrading of the values of light and clean air. Don't be fooled, there's no light in London. So I think, yeah, okay. So we'll have a look at these images. So just 1 second while I remember how to, down there and here. So, okay, slideshow. Is that, you can see the picture? Okay, so I'm sure this video is being written about a lot, but I was really interested, like watching it like over and over, about this as an image of the technicity of expression through the gesture, which is revealed unto itself. So in Peak Libido, Pettman talks about sculpture and rendering the stone passionate. And here I think we can see the rendering of the machine tender. And I think this is quite an important reference point for then thinking about contemporary representations, which reflect a search for ecology more clearly. So of course, at this particular moment, which is 1997, it's much more focused on obviously technicity, technology, and machines. But I think that's what's interesting with this video is the way that in relation to what Pettman was saying about Freud and moving on from a theory of libido, which is so invested in those psychoanalytic structures of heterosexuality, is that the self-relation that we see in this representation, I think, is neither narcissistic or lesbian or seeking recognition from outside of it, its own psychic apparatus. So I think that there's kind of ostensibly Björk technology, like Björk is kind of kissing herself, but then actually I think it's more like an image of tenderness and yearning without an object and for its own sake. So I do think that's a kind of particular moment in representations of femininity or femaleness and desire and the role of the object and technology and so on. And the reason why I thought back to that video is, of course, because of FKA Twig's video for Cellophane, which is, I think, 2000 and it's just a couple of years ago, 19. And obviously there's a reference there to Björk in terms of the face, that's FKA Twigs's face, in this kind of video game, fantastical representation. But what we can see, I think, from FKA Twig, like across those 20 years, is that then the references to technology are kind of shifting in terms of, technologized theory of the environment. I was going to say cosmology, because that, it is kind of fantastical as well as earthly. So there are lots of different tropes and themes in the video, like the use of the mirror, and then eventually she falls through a hole in the earth. She goes up the pole, and then she destroys herself, and then she falls through a hole in the earth, and then she ends up in some mud with some creatures that are wearing masks. So it's hard to kind of describe properly without taking up time, but basically there are images and a search here of and for some kind of ecological some kind of, which is not, you know, a return to nature, that doesn't disavow the mediation and the way that we are, you know, living in a mediated world. And I'm also very interested in the role of the mirror there. And then just two more references. One is to a video by the late Sophie. And actually in this video, it's mainly a headshot where she's singing and then the weather's changing behind her and it's like nighttime and the sun comes up and, you know, then there's a rainbow and etc. And then there's a kind of this moment towards the end where there's like a frisson and there's lightning. And I think that this is, you know, this is not to represent or to depict nature because it is hyper mediated. It's clearly, you know, computer generated images. But at the same time, there's like a real investment in the transversal nature of nature, like erotically and emotionally for us as subjects. And then finally, of course, like this presentation wouldn't be complete without reference to the most recent Perfume video by Burberry with Adam Driver, where he's running with a horse. And the thing that I was struck by was when he's running, he really looks like a machine, like he's physically running like a machine. So it's like the reverse of Björk, like he's becoming the machine. But then of course there's all the landscape and the horses and everything, and then he goes in the water. So again, I think there is this new configuration of like how we're imagining the technological and the natural in this new combination. And then I am going to end with like the real low point, which is of course like, well, what's this really about? I don't think it's greenwashing as such. I mean, I think greenwashing is an interesting discourse to look at, and there, you know, there is a lot of that, like everyone's into having plants and making green commitments and all of that, but of course it's all already mediated through commodification. So in a way there's nothing really that much to analyze, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, it's already a site of capture, even though we do just want plants in our houses. But then, I mean, there is a question there that, you know, around, I suppose around the status of these images, if we were going to take a conjunctural analysis. And it's interesting, of course, I don't think it's uncoincidental that FKA Twigs's music is used for this particular video, given the way that there are themes of nature and Eros and everything in her work. So that's my rambling, you know, opening invitation to conversation.
Wow, for sure, we won't miss insights and provocations from you. I feel like my brain is a kaleidoscopic thing of posthuman ecologies, horses, trenches for some reasons. So interesting analogical associations here. But it's not my duty to offer particular comments and observations at this stage. So I would like to ask Dominic if you want to briefly respond to what Sarah said. And in the meantime, I will do this revolutionary action of promoting to panelists all attendees, which means that then we can have a bit of a more open discussion. So let me tell everybody that you are welcome to turn on your camera because it's always good to see faces. And also this is recorded, but anyways, then we look all so little that nobody will notice if you don't look your best. And feel free to raise your hands, feel free to break in, write a question, write on the chat. I mean, whatever it takes, please do jump in. I know that there are some familiar faces there, and so I really hope that we can have a nice discussion, and I apologize in advance if we will run a bit over time. But now, yes, as I promote to attendees our audience, Dominic, if you want to say something in response to Sarah, I think.
Yes, I mean, wow, that was extremely rigorous and sophisticated and generous to read so closely and to think so deeply about. When you're writing these things, you're throwing out ideas and not necessarily following them through as well as the reader will. I also like the bit about not knowing where the quotation marks are. Is quite nice. It speaks to the whole trans-individual nature of thinking. Oh, so much. You're also reminding me, I do teach the Björk video every few years, and it's great to see how people, each different micro-generation sees these things differently. With your final remarks, you're making me think that political economy might be the bridge between economic thinking and ecological thinking in some ways. If economics, I mean, we're going to have to be very kind of cartoonish about our definitions, but if economics is about value and about transactions, and about regulating the house, it's almost like a sort of the sovereign government of the family. Then ecology is thinking about what the house is literally made out of and where it's situated and what kind of elements it has to deal with, if it's by a river or if it's on the top of a mountain. Is it drafty? So the way you point to the carbon footprint of, say, Burberry is a political economy, is a sort of political economic critique, which is really important. And so I think that's maybe grasping toward that's the bridge for me towards between an economy which is about value and ecology, which is maybe the emphasis is more on limits. But there's still a big overlap. It's not like these are different spheres. It's very much a Venn diagram. And so things like sustainability happen in both. And as you say, exchanges. I mean, speaking of Björk again, Timothy Morton was influential to me early on with his earlier book on ecology without nature. So as you say about London is an ecological site. Obviously, not just where plants and animals sort of poke through the concrete, but in terms of the city itself. This was his critique for sort of romanticizing a holistic version of nature, where it's really, it's the surround just taken without making these ideological distinctions between objects or agents. I do love the injection of humiliation too, because it does feel like my work's getting a little bit new age in some ways with these holistic categories and I don't know, the negativity, maybe it's because I'm responding to the sort of general tone of negativity in the world, but I am interested in kind of that negative side of queer theory. And because sex positivity can be so easily dovetailed with the California ideology and sort of the penchant for polyamory in Silicon Valley. And, I mean, the idea of transgression now is a really tricky one. It was such a sexy idea in the 90s even. And it's now, what is transgression? What would even that look like structurally in 2021? So I think humiliation, yeah, I would love to think this through properly, because I can't do it right on the spot, but humiliating nature obviously comes with the dangers of anthropomorphism, but there's something there about integrity and respect and ethics that's really interesting. And I do think that it's not that I just think, sex is great and we should be having it properly. That's the kind of sex with optimism that you write about. Foucault had swipes at the idea that tomorrow sex will be good again. It's just today that it's a problem. So I don't think that's the narrative necessarily. It's to it's just not to kind of hoard those negative affects and almost wear them as a human badge of honor, a kind of perverse human badge of honor. It's like, we're the only species that's attuned enough or conscious enough or self-reflexive enough to understand humiliation. And that's a kind of it's just a different way of being humanist. So obviously pets understand humiliation, but you could argue that's because they've been Oedipalized, as Deleuze would. But yeah, I write about this short story by Conan Doyle called The Day the Earth Screamed. It is this kind of the raping of the earth motif, when the earth literally shrieks when it's being mined too far. Obviously we don't, that becomes kitsch very quickly. And even worse in terms of appropriation. But it's anything that makes us think more about just the complexity of the context, I think is really, really helpful. Without losing, again, this is me doing my both and trick all the time, but singular prisms of experience, the individual, the monad, still matters. So it's like the experience and we might even say the trauma, if it's humiliation, still matters. So it's a very tricky balancing act to think in the macro lens of the ecological, while still honoring that scale. And I think maybe that's what Guattari was doing with the three ecologies, right? So maybe it's a mistake to just talk about ecology as this one big blob, but to see how there are different intersecting ecologies, such as self, media, and kind of material surround. That would be one way of nuancing it a bit. But I don't have a good answer right now on how humiliation works in the narrative of peak libido or the conceit of peak libido, but I can feel that I need to think it through. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you. So we received a question from anonymous attendee, which is, I think, quite a fashionable sender, I would say. So I'm going to read this question, and I would say the question is for everybody. So not necessarily only for Sarah and Dominic, but for whoever wants to take really this question or comment on this question. And again, feel free to raise your hands, etc., etc. I try to promote everybody to panelists, but I think some remain participants, perhaps because they want to. Anyway, if you have some problems, send me a private message. So anonymous attendees write us. Regarding sustainability and the notions deep entanglement with heterolinearity and retrofuturity, not to mention the Edelmanian figure of the child, perhaps embodied in Greta, could you reflect a bit on this notion of sustainability and perhaps more importantly, its limits? Wow. Would it not be more generative to think of exchanges through a grammar of sustenance, which leads us from ecology as the rules of the house, like oikos, so perhaps economy as the rule of the house, oikos, to a grammar perhaps of care, through notions of food, orifices, viscous porosity of the body as in eating and metabolism, opening up for an understanding of hedonistic sex against the bourgeois sexual morale. I suppose the problem with such a turn, however, would be how we balance intoxication as a queer ecological practice all'appreciado contra the modes of colonial capitalist pollution? That's for you to, I don't know personally. I could get only half of the references of anonymous attendees, but you know what I think sometimes? That there's really, especially when we talk ecologies, post-human, etc., but it has something to do with the activity of philosophy, as Derrida would put it, the activity of creating new concepts, creating new ways of thinking, which also means, in a way or another, creating new words. And I think there is a moment in which, at least sometimes I feel like that, there is a moment in which, okay, we have all these new words, and we play around these new words and see what happens, and see how we can think through in different ways. Yes, and it is an interesting moment. And I think there is a bit of a paradox here, especially when we talk about post-humanism and kind of after the linguistic turn, post-linguistic turn, because we try to do all of it with language, with words, with concepts, with us immaterially on a screen trying to think, ecologists. So I think that there's a nice paradox here. So, okay, well, who wants to say something?
An extremely dense question to start with.
Yeah,
It's like, I thought we might start slow and then go like that. Yeah, it's a lot, but it's obviously very erudite and well informed. My instinct with this one is to historicize and bring back Fourier, who I think is one of the queerest writers we've ever had, even though he was rather a bourgeois guy from Lyon. But his sort of blueprints and plans and for the phalanstery for these communities of people to live in order to these practice passionate attraction. It was, it's a bit of a paradox, because he's Dionysian in some senses, because it's about the joie de vivre and commensality, eating together, being together, orifices, whatever floats your boat. He's very permissive. He's against the hypocrisy of monogamy and patriarchy. He's one of the first feminists on record, in the sense we think of it today. But it's also highly organized. So there's this irony in the sense that he sort of wanted to plan this utopia down to the cutlery, down to the color of your proclivity when the orgy happens. So I suppose, I just think of him as one of our first libidinal ecologists, as opposed to economists, because he's thinking of exchanges, but not in terms of transactional benefit or profit. So he wants everyone, he has this term guaranteeism, he wants everyone to have the maximum amount of pleasure possible from Eros, the gods of Eros. So the question has now actually disappeared from the chat, so I'm not seeing the keywords anymore. But that's what the question made me think of, and I think there's maybe some answers in looking at Fourier. But Sarah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
That just made me think. I really like that bit where you talk about is it the role of the fairies?
Yes.
It's to protect people actually from humiliation, because
yes, fantastic.
And then I was just thinking that, just about the extent to which humiliation just belongs to economy and rather than ecology. Like, I really don't think it's that the affect of shame might be felt in the natural world, but I don't think there's that. I think it has to do, because it has to do with value and hierarchy, and the way that the exchange is mediated by whatever the unit is, or whether it's like a debt relation or whatever. So, and I don't know about sustenance and sustainability, but yeah, I mean, sustainability, yeah, it is about futurity. And yeah, that is partly about the future generations. I mean, it is part, you know, if you talk to anyone who has children, sorry, we all have some kind of parents, or had, especially when when you look at kind of when you start reading like the ecofeminist scholars, and it is about children, but I don't. But also doesn't just have to be like that reproductive Oedipal family form. I mean, I don't think we can just say like child equals, like Oedipalization. So I kind of like the making kin concept from Haraway for that. So I think sustainability, like, which is not my concept, it's Dominic's, but I think it's good.
Well, it's also about sustaining, like, how do you sustain a sense of, how do you just not do these crash and burn cycles like in the market for yourself? I mean, how do you maintain a sort of certain level of curiosity, generosity, exchange, frisson, whatever you want to call it?
Can I say something about the dating app culture, which is also kind of sustainability? I mean, I just can't see. I mean, that must be on the brink of collapse. I just cannot, like, I don't care about the numbers, because that is like the fracking. Like, it's so overcoded and deterministic and algorithmic that it actually it forecloses experience almost entirely. And I first wrote about it because I found it entertaining, right? Because you do. Because I mean, you just, of the way that you see the same reason people always wanted to write about any new media phenomena. I mean, it's the kind of self-exposure and the kind of different people's presumptions and their tastes. And, it's really interesting. If you're interested in people and social relations, you suddenly, have this like wealth of representations and relations to think through, but it is completely unsustainable. And I do think there's sustainability is an important concept in terms of thinking about something around what works. So like what those apps can't do is be ecological or erotic in some way, because the way in which they encode relies so much on something going on in the background, which we can't really see, but it's definitely pornography. But then also there just seem to be like other vectors of experience and communication that seem to like foreclose or determine what's possible in that environment. So I mean, sustainability is also, isn't it, about the question of sustaining desire? Like, I mean, but then that just goes back to that more like libidinal economy idea in terms of like, it's exciting to be with someone new, and then there's a marriage, and then you can't sustain that excitement because you have to do childcare or whatever. So you can see like that it just sucks you into the economic theory, like the minute you start thinking about.
Then that's entropy too. So that's where it's not just about economics, it's about, well, this is why Bataille is interesting for me as well, because what he talks about general economy is cosmic. It's about energy and thermodynamics. So that's maybe Carolina's point as well, is it can just become semantics at a certain point. Like we make these distinctions because they're useful for our models, but from a different angle, entropy happens in different registers, in different locations, in different places, in different ways.
Yeah, and I think what I found very difficult is at some point, I think you said, Dominic, like, okay, let's partially ditch the concept of libidinal economy and the centrality of the human, and let's try to speak of libido from the point of view of libido. And that reminds me, okay, I'm gonna be a bit pop here, but anyways, that reminds me of a friend of mine. During, we were not completely sober, and he asked us during this party Arturo, my brother, may remember. So how was the spiderness of the spider? How does a spider think? And it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of a spider, let alone of the whole thermodynamic energy of the cosmos. And I wonder if isn't it like the ultimate arrogance also, in a sense? Okay, now me, human, I'm going to put the human besides, and I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the cosmic thermodynamic energies. But then, I mean, this is of course, it's just meant to be a provocation that you don't necessarily have to answer to. But it's lysergic. Is a lysergic move, and quite productive. And I do see the importance of thinking differently, and the move from economy and ecology also makes a lot of sense. And how we can think of an ecological sexual relationship rather than transactional sexual relationship. I'm just picking up on some of the ideas that you threw on the table and that I think are quite interesting. And I would welcome if some of you have some comments or questions. And in the meantime, I'm reading Fahad's question. Of course, Fahad, if you want to jump in and elaborate, feel free. Otherwise, I'm just reading it. In Posthuman Eros, what is the progenic value of intimacy?
Posthuman Eros.
Take this one, like this. Ta-ta.
I'm not sure quite what you mean by progenic in that context. Why emphasize? I mean, is the question is a simpler way?
Offspring.
What is the? Yeah, this is. I mean, one of the things I have, one of the concepts that have really stuck with me is Leo Bersani's notion of impersonal intimacy. That intimacy is not necessarily a kind of, this phrase the kids use now today, I feel seen. It's a very kind of egocentric self. It's sort of like, I feel, it's Levinas, right? It's like, I feel recognized in my sort of singularity, which is lovely. We all love that feeling. But Bersani, he writes about, the sort of particular jouissance of cruising and anonymous sex and things like that, is more interested in, this impersonal intimacy that, again, where does this fit in the secular? Because it speaks to a sort of generic form of life that we all inhabit to some degree. Like, I'm Dominic, but I'm also human X, or just like the being that's sort of some of my DNA, and sort of generic, everything I'm even saying is sort of ventriloquial because of my bibliography. So it's that question of how much of you is really you. And so the post-human, like in the Björk video, that's very intimate, but you don't get this sense of two unique, full subjectivities, sort of mutually recognizing and reinforcing each other. There's something else going on there. So to me, that's where intimacy is, the post-human eros and impersonal intimacy is. You could also see it in the animal kingdom, I think, with just the contingency of courtship and the randomness of one bowerbird has this particular aesthetic, or this water strider will use this type of kind of physics to blackmail the female into having sex with him. There are types of intimacy that aren't intimate in a Henry James sense, but in a kind of just because of the specificity and locality of the encounter. That would be my quick
Arturo, do you want to say
thoughts on that.
something? You have your hands up.
First of all, thank you both for very thought-provoking presentations. I have a question, really. It's something I've been thinking about in recent months. And it seems to me that perhaps is a missing word from this, from a lot of words, but it seems like it's there, and it's about waste. The idea of waste, the idea of a remainder, of an excess, of something that cannot be metabolized. And we know, and that was something that Freud talks about, but also I think we can find many instances before that waste is libidinal. Things that are trash turns us on. I mean, you can think about junk food, you can think about sex, which is as a dimension of a remainder of something that is not fully ever metabolized in the social. But also, of course, there is an ecological problem of waste, of the footprint. It came to my mind as Dominic was talking about the footprint of desire. And it seems to me that desire and waste are in some sense intertwined, and libido and waste are intertwined. And it seems that waste comes to, I don't know, have a role, maybe a philosophical even status to think about, I don't know, even ontological maybe for some. And so I just wanted to throw that in the mixer because it's something I've been thinking about. And of course, waste as a human waste, or as Bauman would say, the wasted human and the human waste being also both
Waste of time
in relation with each other. Wasted time, yeah. Just that. If you have any thoughts on that.
I feel like I've been talking too much, but but if Sarah or Anya or somebody would like to answer that one. I mean, I agree with you, Arthur. I think that makes me think of Bataille's again as well. That's one of his big categories. But on the one hand, it's something to encourage. I think Fourier, for instance, would, because, like you say, if it's not metabolized efficiently in society, you want to squander things. You want to do way too much. Excesses. There's even a book. There's a biology book called Exuberant Nature, I think, which shows that even the natural world is too much in some ways. It's like extra. And so I think it's the question, as Bataille said, what do you do with the waste? Do you sacrifice it? How does it, in a cosmic economy, how do you metabolize it? And that's distinct from the social. So I think you're right. It's one of those important blocking points that potentially slow the perfect, easy, smooth circulation of capital, but it's also the side that's going to swallow us up if we don't figure it out. I mean, there's this great website called Lol My Thesis, where you distill your dissertation to one sentence. If you've never been there, it's very entertaining. But some days, I think my Lol My Thesis version of the book is, we're too busy fucking the planet to fuck each other. The nutshell version. But
a remarkable synthesis. I would say. I mean, the algorithm or AI of the website got it quite right, quite smart. So we have on the table quite a lot of words. We have posthuman, ecology, we have waste, we have humiliation. Feel free to, like we are jazzing a bit, I feel today. So
if I may.
Yes, please, Daniel. I'm keen to hear what you think.
First, I need to say hello to Sarah, to everybody, but to Sarah and to Dominic, whom I miss dearly, and I miss New York.
Yes, likewise.
So saying hi. And thank you for your amazing presentations. And I find it, quite poignant and very, very touching, because, the second, the moment the seminar started, I was completing my book, Loving Contemporary Technoculture. And last night I received a decision that it has been accepted for publication, and I mentioned this only because, you know, this is a book in which I'm quoting both, referring to both the work of Sarah and the work of Dominic. So it's kind of, you know, it's an amazing cycle for me. Thank you for your work, for your presentations today. And if I may say something, sort of like a wrap-up comment concerning waste, specifically time waste, and perhaps humiliation as related to impersonal intimacy. One of the chapters in my book deals with an idea of fast love, which implies that, you know, we are trying to live the processes, like use it like a time to metabolize things which cannot be metabolized, you know, in this moment of acceleration, digital acceleration. And there is too much waste. We are surrounded by waste because, you know, the waste, like, you know, has no time to kind of to disappear. And it also relates to what Sarah said about like the unsustainability of online dating, and I agree. I was interviewing quite, I mean, when COVID, like, you know, hit, and when there was like the first wave of COVID, I was interviewing people who decided to start online dating for the first time. Yes, because like, you know, of no other opportunities. And it's a funny thing that despite the fact that they admitted the kind of being surrounded by waste and the impossibility of, like, you know, dating in those like in those digital environments, they expressed a longing for perhaps the ideal of love and the ideal of like togetherness we have so far humiliated by means of those platforms. So this is what I've been thinking about, like, you know, and all those things are just connected. Like I agree, this is not sustainable. I believe, you know, that the surge, yes, we've observed, yes, the invasion on online dating platforms and like, you know, other online or digital dating services or any other digital forms of like togetherness. They're just kind of, you know, they reach this peak and are already on a wane because of the sense of longing we already feel for, like the pining for something we've humiliated, we perhaps lost. I don't want to be like, you know, just glamorizing the idea of lost ideal, because, you know, I'm more, you know, for thinking about continuity rather than novelty. And this is something I write in my book as well. We just kind of, you know, I'm very much about the love is a code, and we just continue like remediating the same, transmediating the same code over different media. But it was like quite striking that each and every interviewee, especially men, apparently, and they were just telling me, dude, I'm looking for love. I'm looking for intimacy, for like real togetherness. I want to be close to somebody. I feel alone. And it's odd because, you know, it's just like obvious that it cannot be achieved over those platforms. When the platform started, it was a different story, but now, come on, it's like over-calculated everything. So this is what I was thinking. I wasn't thinking about humiliation, but, you know, you were just kind of, you know, I love this kind of the word, kind of like the new apparatus, like for me to think about it by means of humiliation. We have perhaps humiliated, yes, certain ideals, certain codes already. And we've seen the backstage of the codes of certain practices. And now there is this kind of overwhelming longing because we see the waste. We can see that we are surrounded by waste. So this is kind of, you know, perhaps like an overly romantic comment on my side, but, you know, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, just kind of in a very condensed way about all those problems. You know what it's like to write a book, so it's so intense. The more I thank you for just like, providing like a linking notions, linking ideas for my own trajectory of thinking.
Thank you, Anya. And Sarah, I couldn't help noticing that you were taking a lot of notes. So I know that you have something to share with us. And so if you're fine to stay some more minutes, resisting our hunger and thirst, or eating. I have some almonds. They are good. And of course, they say that they are ethical and recycled, etc. Not the almonds are recycled, but the plastic. Anyway, Sarah.
I'm sorry, it's just another question. But my question is about visibility, which is a whole other thing. But there are lots of things that there are some things I've heard said in this forum, but also I just hear them said where I just like, no, that is not really a correct statement, although it's not entirely wrong either. But for example, comments around these platforms being anonymous, right? Which is not true, okay? If you're on them long enough, you actually see people change, right? You see people you know. And also this kind of, maybe the question of like ethical non-monogamy would be a good case study to kind of look through some of the transformations, and you mentioned that as well, Dominic, and obviously this is important to queer theory and gay culture and so on. And I wanted to ask and make a question or a comment about the Edelman and the impersonal intimacy, and just I think, I guess what I'm thinking is that, like, in the context of this culture, you know, that possibility is increasingly foreclosed, and obviously it has to do with heteronormativity. And I'm really interested in how we can make visible, like, the mechanics or like the political economy of that change, right, in how people approach going on to a dating app. And or we can, I suppose we could learn from people like who've done the study of intimacy, alone Sherry Turkle. She narrates that, you know, the moment where the internet was exciting and we were all liberated and gonna have multiple personalities and personas, blah blah blah, and then Facebook came along and that's it, one identity, and then, you know, that's it, it's over. And dating app culture came into that space. It came into the Zuckerberg space, not into the liberated space. Even though you see a lot of, you know, you see people wrestling with the issue, right? So people write meta narratives, and they, you know, they try and make a space, right, for something else. Some people, and it is virtually impossible in the real sense of what that means. So I suppose it's a sort of methodological question. I was thinking about whether you need to do things like hang around in Reddit groups and, you know, participate in the chat, you know, to actually trace the discourse, because, you know, it is a systemic pattern. It's not like all of a sudden people felt mean that day or got defensive that day or wanted to trick you that day. Like it is systemic, but there's a weird visibility that I don't think we really know what it is. And we kind of know what the elements are. We know it's to do with the algorithm. We know it's to do with profiles, but there's something specifically about the way that gender, even though I'm loath to use the term, but gender is functioning like in a new way, like it is a new gender, but like not in that exciting way that people who wrote about technology were like, oh, let's play around and, you know, mess up gender. It's like the complete, like, you know, backlash or, you know, reaction to the, yeah, it's the extreme constraint, you know, in the context of, you know, what could be so many things, right? So they're not, but I really love how you put things together, Anya. That's great. Yeah.
But, you know, just kind of, you know, to kind of, you know, to follow up kind of your way of thinking, it's just like, you know, with all queer tendencies, and, you know, I was using your work on like gay cultures and online dating as well. It's like technology became a form of assimilationism, just like any other structures are. Like, instead of like, you know, producing like difference, it became like a form of assimilationism. But I would like to add one more point, something I discovered like doing my own research during the time of the pandemic. And it relates to the Sherry Turkle idiom of alone together, which I flip. I do not think that we are alone together, that we feel alone and want to be together. I think it's the other way around, and this is what technologists unveil, that we want to be together alone. So we want company, we want to consume the codes, but we shun human company, apparently, like company understood traditionally. So we do want to be together, like, with other people, like using the platforms, but on our own. And this, this is a kind of very, very like a new, it's not a new, it's a kind of a revelation to me that, it's just like, and yes, of course, like there is no anonymity, and it's not about anonymity. I've never had, and it's a confession I've never made, only one friend knows it, because it compromises me completely as a kind of digital love and relationship scholar. I've never had a real, like, private OkCupid or Tinder account, never ever. I've just used like accounts that have been explicitly research-based, and I've been always very explicit that I'm here to do research. So it's just like, I've never like, I don't like find it convincing, but just kind of the very mechanics. It's about being visible. It's about like being non-anonymous. It's about like being everywhere. And but like I say, maybe it's not new, but this kind of like, on the one hand, like paradoxical thing, and I believe this is the peak, the exhaustion symptom. Yes, that we don't want to be together. We want to be on our own, but we just kind of, we long togetherness. We have no idea what the together is anymore. We know it's something compromised, something we've humiliated. So this is like, what I've been like dealing with lately, and I'm just wondering what's next. Like, what will be the like what's the new formula for producing this togetherness,
especially post-COVID. I mean, we've hardly mentioned it, right? But the longer social distancing and paranoia goes, and the whole vax equation goes, the more our gestures and our instincts will become, overdetermined by biopolitical kind of questions. And so, but and congratulations on the book. I mean, great news. You also have the data dating book coming out soon too. So yes, I mean, but the very fact that OkCupid is called OkCupid and goes back to this long genealogy of matchmaking, which Fourier was very involved with as well. Mackenzie Wack has a nice piece on how Fourier was kind of the first dating algorithm, the way he wanted to match people's proclivities with each other. But exhaustion, ironically, might be the most sustainable thing there is. I've been writing about exhaustion for 30 years, and we thought social media would implode at this point, or, the kind of, it's just old capitalism, right? It was supposed to be late capitalism 50 years ago. So that's the scary part, is how much, that's where the posthuman, where the Teflon really hits the road, or whatever you want to call it, is the extent to which the bios the Zoe is willing to be reconfigured by the bios, or whatever, to give the ghost of Agamben, who's a bit of a bête noire now, but it's influenced my thinking as well. But yeah, like, to what degree are we just shrug our shoulders and say, well, this is it now. This is the context, and these are the limits. This is the frame. And now we have to eke out, squeeze some more, drops of jouissance from this or that as compensation. But it's like with a labor issue and things, it's like we're expected to do more for less, be grateful for it. And it's incredible how sustainable that model is actually. Even as it lurches from crisis to crisis, it's almost like, what will it take? You know? So I'm a great believer in this. Things weren't better before, but they're definitely getting worse. That's my credo when it comes to all of this. So I try to end on a positive note, but in the midst of the plague and the climate catastrophes happening, and then the fact that we're not sitting around a big table, clunking our globalists together, it is sad. So I think we can recognize and acknowledge that, and hope that somewhere, somehow, there is some clinamen, some little swerve that helps us honor better ways of conducting Eros together.
Mm-hmm.
Too sweeping
Well.
and dramatic. But I can't even claim my own words now because I haven't had lunch yet. So my blood sugar levels are talking, not me.
Well, thank you very much to everybody. And I think a good old sad note is fine, also because we are at the end of this series of seminars, events, whatever you want to call them. And they have been academically, I would say, the best thing that happened this year to me, and that I made it happen together with a lot of other people and with you. And it was a way to escape from the ways in which the department, the institution kind of sucked my libido.
Mm-hmm.
So that
you're a living example of modeling. You're modeling how to do it, how to make it happen despite it all.
Yeah, but the problem is that it was like, 6 events, 7, 8 events, I don't remember, and then there was the rest of my life. But it is a thing, like how the libidinal investment that you make in objects or subjects or whatever you want to call them is definitely something that it's very much outside or behind or underneath, next to the ego or whatever agency one might think to have. Then you can go psychoanalytical, you can go cosmo-energetical, doesn't matter. It does matter, but definitely it's not something that we can play around very much with. And I think, like, dating apps, according to my what my research has shown, is that there is, nonetheless, there is a lot of libido attached to them. There's a lot of being there. There's a lot of compulsion. There's a lot of jouissance, and perhaps the jouissance is also the jouissance of the longing. I mean, I think that you capture this ambivalence. On the one hand, the longing for the creaturely warmth, and on the other hand, the compulsion to repeat a pattern that, of course, is not going to bring you any closer to the creaturely warmth, if not for an exception, a mistake, a strike of luck. And I think that the underlying fantasy of the dating app user is, okay, at some point I gamble, perhaps at some point I win. Perhaps at some point there's the one. It's like winning the lottery a bit. And it replicates the Hollywood motif about love. What is love? Oh, I dropped my book. The man of my life, no? And so it's a bit the same. So in this sense, I see continuity. But what is definitely worth of attention, and Dominic's article for me was very inspiring, is that yet there is this libidinal attachment to the app. Like, you touch it, you do things with it, and it's this bearer of possibilities. Like, perhaps one day. So there is this ambivalence between the longing and the compulsion, in a sense, and there's definitely also an enjoyment in longing, an enjoyment in saying, oh,
Cruel optimism.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I know we all need to eat, but what's the object of the investment? Is it the fantasy, the cruel optimism, or because because then yes, of course, that's the mediation, that's the, you know, it's the actual object, right? But like the investment isn't in the, I mean, it is and it isn't, right? Because it's the fantasy. So I was just thinking, yeah, because it's so weighted, you know, with the whole life that will, because, you know, in terms of waste, of course, there's a wasted life, right? Which is a life that isn't intimate or recognized as intimate. So, so yeah, it's the whole world that comes with intimate attachment is gambled, which so. But I'm not. This isn't what I'm good at in terms of like figuring out how to theorize actually like mediation or materiality. I have to say, like I'm okay to, like, you know, talk about the fantasy and the affect, but I do think you need a different set of terms, which is more like other people's work who are here to talk about the actual technology.
Well, you reminded me also how we slip between these terms, and I'm thinking of Berlant's lovely little book, The Desire Love book, and how we confuse them. You know, if love is the fantasy, is the narrative, the sort of conventional narrative, the Hollywood version that Carolina was talking about, that's an object that you invest in, and yet it's propelled by a different kind of different force. So that's the tension within all of us all the time. So even if you do find the one, it's never. That's a whole other complicated thing. It's more like you wouldn't fall in love if you hadn't been told about love in the first place. That whole idea. So it's you learn to have these goals, even as everything from pheromones to to things that work against your own interests, self-sabotage, etc. It's sometimes far more you know, interesting to the libido. Anyway, we could talk about this forever, and I'm sure we will as long as we can.
I think we need to
in a different session.
To go. I want to acknowledge Ted's suggestion of Sophie Lewis and a movie where a gay man has sex with landfills.
With yes.
I just wanted to acknowledge it because they were important contribution. Right, Anna, did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted you know that, you know, it's very clear to me that, you know, despite all those things we've just said, we are clearly anticipating some shift, and, you know, this like change, like this is like this exhaustion speaks to us. We just keep, like, you know, speculating about like the possible change, and talking about like unsustainability, about like predetermination of patterns, codes, and narratives, and I believe it's a form of a libido in itself. Like there is something titillating in the very anticipation of a shift, I guess. But, you know, I hate like positive psychology, but I find it quite optimistic, sort of, that we just kind of, you know, we gathered together to talk about love. It's good.
Things can be heartening without being optimistic.
Okay, so I feel like I must let you go. I'd like to have you all here. Fortunately, Tara is so close that we're gonna have some creaturely drinks. And we will meet you.
We will be there in spirit.
Yeah, it would be so good to have you. Anya, can you imagine? Yeah. Finally meeting in flesh and bones. Okay, so have a good longing for the time that will come. Let's long for
longing them.
And I shall be in touch. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Lots of love.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. It's great seeing you.